Hi everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and this week we're going to continue our look at some of the great tactical moments in David Bronstein's career. You might remember this position, we looked at it last week, and the game went knight c3, knight to d7, and then bishop to h6 with it forced immediate resignation here. We looked at the details last time. But there was a variation here that Bronstein mentions in his book, and it's a very nice one. And so I thought I would actually look at this before we go on to a couple of more intricate examples in the rest of the program. So here, as we just saw, Bronstein played knight to c3. But see if you can figure out something that's even better for him. And the position does look really ripe for something. I mean, black clearly has a lot of kind of weak points. White's pieces are very aggressively posted. So it's not really surprising to discover that there could be some nasty tactic here. So see if you can come up with something. Okay, well the answer is, or it begins with the move knight to d6. Very aggressive move. Okay, of course black can maybe play bishop takes d6, but if bishop takes d6, queen takes d6 is quite good. Maybe even queen takes f6, bishop takes g3, but just queen takes d6 followed by bishop takes f6 gives him a big advantage. Black could play queen to d5, but then white would just swap queens and have a serious advantage in the ending. So the most interesting variations begin with the move queen to d7. So this attacks the knight again, and it looks as if black is kind of holding everything together. For one thing, if the knight on d4 retreats, let's say to a square like f3, well, then I think, okay, well actually this might be playable. It may not be the end of the world, but it's not especially forcing either. So let's see if we can find something better here. Well, the answer is a pretty remarkable one. It's knight to c6. So this is a pretty extraordinary move. Now, if black does nothing about this, well, okay, first of all, there's a threat of knight takes f7. All right, so we've got this for starters. And if king to g8, then we can take on f6, utilizing the new pin on the g-pawn, and that just destroys black's position. So what does he do? He can't move the rook, because then knight takes f7 is even stronger. If he moves the queen, well, okay, maybe queen to c7 could be considered. But, okay, black isn't really gaining anything. Oh, no, sorry, queen c7. Yeah, can't do that because knight f7 check again, and queen takes c7. So really the only thing he can try at this point is queen takes c6. All right, but it's not really immediately evident what's so bad about that. So you might want to take a moment here, if you didn't think of knight to d6 or knight to c6, and figure out the remainder of the combination. Well, it begins with bishop takes f6. Now, if bishop takes f6, we have a very nice, neat, clean, and decisive continuation. Queen takes f6. So we're threatening queen takes g7 mate. If rook to g8, then knight takes f7 is a smothered mate. And if g takes f6, then we have knight takes f7 anyway. Rook f7, rook to d8, and it's mate in no more than 2 moves. So it's very nice, but black can also take with the pawn. And here that combination doesn't work because if queen f6, bishop f6, knight f7, rook d8, that bishop is still alive, and from f6 it can capture on d8. But what white can do is play queen to e3, threatening queen to h6, and on queen c2, simply rook c1, and if black wants to have a defense to queen h6, he pretty much has to play queen g6. Then we take, say f takes, and white is just winning here. So material is approximately even, but the attack continues. So rook to c7, and on bishop takes d6, queen h6. Very nice. The only defense to mate on g7 or h7 is bishop takes c7, and here though, queen f8 is mate. So really a beautiful combination by Bronstein. Of course, well, he didn't play it in the game, but he found it, and it's a very attractive line. So I thought I would share that with you guys before going on to our official business for this week. Okay, so this is a game between Bronstein and Keres from the Göteborg Interzonal in 1955. Both players ended up qualifying for the candidates, but this was certainly a painful defeat for Keres. Okay, so we start after the move d takes c4 with a very attractive looking position for white. I mean, certainly his bishops are looking quite beautiful here. They're both pointing directly at the black king side. This knight's ready to come into f5. Maybe this other knight will come to d6. And so certainly there's cause for alarm in the black camp. But, okay, black is up 2 pawns. His development is fairly logical and coherent. And white has to prove that he has something here. So see if you can figure out what white to move ought to do in this position. Well, one move that comes to mind, at least if you're not looking for a kind of white to move and win solution to the problem, is knight to f5. So the knight comes in, and sacrifices on g7 and h6 are certainly in the air. And there's also the idea of putting a knight on d6 now. So this looks, in fact, very strong with the simple double attack. The problem, though, is that after takes, rook e6, all of a sudden white really doesn't have anything special. So he could take the pawn on c4, but okay, that doesn't really help him with his attack. Black is still a pawn up. And if white plays knight takes b7, well, simply queen to c7, and this knight is trapped and is just going to be lost. And at that point, black will have a very good game. So black is at least clearly better here. So let's go back to our starting position and try again. Well, the most dangerous move, I'm not sure if it wins by force, but it's, as I said, certainly extremely dangerous, is bishop takes h6, and this is what Bronstein played. Now, if black doesn't take it, white is certainly in good shape and might even continue taking other pawns. So, for instance, if rook to e8, bishop takes g7, and then knight f5 check, and the queen comes to d2, and then g5 or h6, and certainly with tremendous attacking chances. So black might as well take, and so he did. And now white has time to just play queen to d2, simply threatening the pawn. And here black has a couple of moves. Well, he actually maybe has a few moves that are worth considering. We'll just look at 2 of them. So knight to h7 is played in the game, and knight to c5. Okay, on knight to c5, remarkably, white can continue in this kind of quiet building up vein with rook a to e1. So at some point, white will absolutely take on h6. But the thing is, there's not really a rush for him to do so, because black has no real way of defending the pawn. I mean, if he plays king to g7, then knight to f5 check is just fantastic. And, okay, playing a move like h5 is meaningless. I mean, the point isn't the pawn so much as to get the queen to g5 or h6. So knight to d3 is certainly a very natural move here. So takes, and now queen h6. Finally, there's nothing really better for white to play. And now moves like knight to f5 and or rook to e5 with the idea of rook to g5 check, well, mate in this case, are both in the air. So this is, I think, possibly a crucial position for black. And there are at least 3 moves that we can consider here. First move we'll look at is the kind of standard move rook to e8 with the idea of playing bishop to f8. So for instance, knight f5, bishop f8. Now, white is winning here though. Queen to g5 check. Now knight b to d6. So we bring a new piece into play. And of course black can't play bishop takes d6 because mate is looming on g7. So rook to e6. And now a very cute move, rook to e3. So he kind of copies black here, but it's a bit more dangerous than black's defensive idea. Of course, he's threatening to give mate, starting with rook to h3. So knight to g8. If he takes on e3, then f takes e3 is quite strong, and the other rook is going to come up to f4 and h4. So knight to g8, queen check, knight here, takes, takes, and now we grab this. And in fact, white doesn't have to give mate anymore, he's simply up material. So he's up a pawn, but knight to f7 is a big, big threat. And black's king is still very exposed. He has some weak pawns, so white is winning here. Okay, so let's go back to this position after queen takes h6. Rook e8 didn't do the job. Another kind of stock defensive idea is to play knight to h7. And here, again, I think there's a clear forced win, starting with knight f5, threatening mate on g7, bishop f6, and now simply rook to e3. And the point is to play rook g3 check, and then rook to g7. And black really doesn't seem to have any efficient means of defense against this idea. If he played, for instance, instead of rook to e8, if he plays king to h8, with the idea of maybe of playing rook to g8 in response to rook to g3, well, the problem with this is that we just play rook to h3, and that's decisive. Okay, so going back to this position after queen takes h6, we saw rook to e8 doesn't work. We saw that knight to h7 doesn't work. But there's also the move knight to e8. But this move, which is I think the best defensive try, I'm going to leave to you to figure out. And you can put it in comments if you want, if you can figure out a win for white, or if you think that black holds. I'll leave that as an exercise for you guys. Okay, well, let's turn to what happened in the game. So we've been looking after queen at d2. So it was bishop takes h6, g takes h6, queen at d2. We just considered knight to c5 in some detail. But Keres played knight to h7. And after queen takes h6, played f5, hoping to buy his way out. But after knight f5 takes and takes, even though the material situation is perfectly fine, black has two minor pieces for a rook and a pawn, still, black's king's position is so open that this is really tough. And Bronstein was simply able to build up, bring his remaining pieces into the attack, and eventually win. So, knight f8, rook over, bishop g5, queen h5, queen f6, knight to d6, queen g4, threatening to win the bishop with h4, bishop to e4. And so now white has a little material advantage, and black's king is still as exposed as ever. Also, taking the pawn on c4 not only grabs a pawn, not only threatens the knight on a6 and the pawn on c6, but also makes possible the rook lift, rook to d3. So black plays knight to c5, which saves both the knight, the pawn, and stops rook to d3, but b4. Queen c6. Okay, so now white has a rook and three pawns for the bishop and knight. And his rook is in the game as well. Okay, threatening f5. Okay, and the game ends pretty quickly. If knight takes f4 now, then simply queen to c7 is winning. Knight to d4 was played in the game. Queen d5, threatening rook to d8, threatening knight to h5. Okay. And okay, in this position, the game ends almost right away. Queen f3, stopping, or well, saving the queen, keeping the mate covered, and offering a trade of queens, which is just fine since white is up significant material now. So black tried this last little trick with knight to e2, and okay, it's a simple tactic, but see if you can figure out what white played in this position. So don't get confused here by black's little bid for attention here. So he's threatening the knight, he's threatening the rook on d6, and if queen takes g3, well, that's no good, because then knight g3, knight f1. Actually, no, that's not even clear. So queen g3, knight g3, and then if king h2, knight f1, and if king g1, king takes g7. Okay, but white put an end to all of this fun by simply playing rook to h6 check, and it's mate next move. Mate in 2 on king takes g7. So rook h6, if king g8, queen f7 is mate, and if king takes g7, then queen f6, and then queen h8 or rook to h8 is decisive. Okay, so a very nice attacking game by Bronstein. and it's kind of an intuitive sacrifice. So it's not really a combination with bishop takes h6. It's simply a matter of judgment, because there are a lot of quiet moves, especially in that knight to c5 line that we looked at. So it's really a matter of judgment, and it takes a lot of guts to play like this in such a major event. I mean, this is a qualifier for the candidates, which is the final step before a world championship. So pretty impressive for Bronstein to play this way, both in terms of what he came up with and just having the guts to play like this. But I have to say, Bronstein was always a very, very gutsy player throughout his career. Okay, well, let's look at our final Bronstein example for this show, and I'm sure for a while. So we're not going to turn this into the super fast Bronstein series or anything like that. So this will be it for a while. Okay, so this is a very famous game that he won against Mikhail Tal in the Soviet Championship in 1968. And Bronstein, one of the many distinctives of his chess that really encouraged him, or really encouraged fans to love the guy and his chess, is that he was a regular practitioner of the King's Gambit. So really, I mean, he and Spassky were the only two top players who had the guts to play such an opening. And both did well. In fact, Spassky, in his career, never lost with the King's Gambit. Now, he had to get lucky a few times, but still, I mean, he played it against Fischer, he played it against Karpov, and never lost a game with it. Incredible. Now, Bronstein, I don't believe, had the same success, but he had tremendous success with it too. So, I mean, he didn't go quite as far as never losing, but was quite successful with it. Okay, well, Tal, of all things, played the Falkbeer counter gambit, and it followed theory for quite a while. So this is all still known. So you can find this in any book, certainly on the King's Gambit. And okay, here Bronstein played bishop to a3. And all right, we'll just make a few more moves here. It's very dangerous for black to take on d5. I'm not sure if it loses, but it's not considered good. So knight to d7, castles, bishop e4, knight to g5, bishop takes d5, and okay, this is a good place to start and to try to figure out what white to move ought to do. So black just grabbed this pawn back. Material is actually slightly in black's favor now, but white has the bishop pair, and black's king is, at least for the moment, in the center. So see if you can figure out what white should do. So this is definitely a position to stop the recording and to really give it a good workout before you wait for me to tell you what happened. Okay, well, Bronstein came up with a fantastic idea here. You could probably play a move like rook to e1 check. That's probably not bad. Maybe bishop to b5. I'm not sure about that. Maybe c4. I mean, there are some moves that look kind of normal. Rook to d4 certainly makes sense, attacking the knight. And if the knight moves, of course, then the bishop on d5 is hanging. So there are a number of moves that are quite attractive, certainly deserve a look. But Bronstein found just a fantastic idea. He played the move g3. And he comments, I think, in 200 open games that basically he couldn't resist playing such a move against Tal. I mean, you know, Tal, who of course is a great master of sacrifice and attack, to kind of turn the tables against him is always a real pleasure. Though, of course, Bronstein himself is a great master of sacrifice and attack. Okay, well here, there's really nothing else to do. I mean, if the knight moves from f4, rook takes d5, and white's just up a piece. So this is forced. G takes f4. And, all right, now we've got a decision to make for black. If he castles long, then if nothing else, white has knight takes f7, winning back the exchange and maintaining various advantages in the position, including the bishop pair, and a very hungry bishop pair it is. Also, bishop to h3 would be on the agenda. So Tal found a very good move here. He played c5, trying to cut this bishop on a3 from the game and at least make his king a bit safer. Okay, well again, white has a number of pretty attractive possibilities here. So see what you can come up with at this point. So no bang, bang, bang win or anything like that. but look for a way that will give white the best chances to sustain his initiative. I mean, he is down the exchange in a pawn, so it's pretty significant. He's got to have something good to keep the action going. Well, I think there are at least 3 moves that merit consideration. One is rook to e1 check, which we won't look at, but I just pointed out because it's, well, first of all, it prevents black from castling, so we take care of that issue. If the king goes to d8, there's knight takes f7. And if the king goes to f8, well, okay, it's shutting in the rook on h8, and maybe something like bishop to b5 or bishop to h3, with the idea of taking the knight and also maybe taking on c5 next. It becomes possible. Another idea might be bishop to c4, just hitting f7 after king f8. So a lot of very attractive possibilities there. Okay, so that's variation 1. A second very interesting line is just to play knight takes f7. And if king takes f7, then rook takes d7 check, and white's pieces are just incredibly active and dangerous. So let's take a quick look at that. So here, rook d7, and it's kind of tough. If black doesn't bother the king, the rook, excuse me, then bishop takes c5 is very likely to occur, bringing the bishop back into the game. And white would only be down the exchange for a pawn there, but with tremendous activity. If black plays king to e6, then there's bishop to h3 check, so the bishop comes out and defends the rook, and then bishop takes c5 next. And similarly, if king to e8, then bishop to b5 should be pretty good. If bishop to c6, well, lots of things we can play then. We could just take, and play rook g7. The c5 pawn falls next. Black's rooks aren't connected, so this is not really much fun. So king f7 is no good. If rook to f8, then knight to g5, and Bronstein's comment is with many new threats. And that seems to be right. So now there's the threat of knight to e6, which hits this rook, hits the pawn, and threatens knight to c7 check. He's also threatening just knight takes h7. Okay, it's not that exciting, but it's material. Bishop to b5 is in the air. Rook to e1 check is a more serious threat. So rook e1. The king has nowhere to go except to d8, and then there's again knight to e6 check, and the rook is hanging. So black is in, I don't know that he's lost here, but it's just a very tough position to play. However, after knight f7, bishop to f3 looks like a real improvement. And it seems like white maybe has nothing better than knight to d6 check, rook d3. And after this move by black, he seems to be okay, maybe even a little bit better. So I think knight takes f7, while it's very, very interesting, this good move bishop to f3 maybe puts a bit of throws a bit of cold water. I mean, of course, white can take the rook, but bishop d1, king d1, king e7, and at the end of the day, black is up a full exchange, and should be winning. Okay, maybe bishop to h3 takes. All right, but this is just no fun for white. I mean, it's just struggling for a draw. So let me put a little notation here for myself. Okay, so the final option is the one chosen by Bronstein in the game, and I think it's actually a very good move. Bishop to c4. So we threaten the bishop on h1. We threaten to take on f7. Pretty natural. Okay, so bishop to c6, knight f7. But now Tal makes another good move, and this is part of what makes this all so complicated, b5. And you kind of had to see this move because, all right, it hits the bishop has to keep the knight protected, and there's b4 coming as well. So just tactics everywhere here. Now, this is a place where I think Bronstein went a little bit awry. So what should white do in this position? Well, Bronstein shows a very natural approach here. He played knight to d6 check, king e7, and then knight takes b5. So he keeps his bishop here. He's got a pawn for the exchange. His pieces are all still quite active. But if Tal had played bishop takes b5 here, and then rook h to d8, it looks as if he's probably equalized here. White could regain the pawn, could gain the c5 pawn, but giving up this nice light squared bishop probably isn't worth it. So after takes, and takes, black is probably a little bit better now. Not enough to win. I mean, it's probably a draw would be the result that objectively should be expected, but it's not as much fun for white. So this would have been black's best try, and then white should do something besides taking on d7 and then on c5 most likely. Okay, well, let's go back though. So instead of knight to d6 check, as natural and attractive as it looks, rook to e1 check would have been best. Okay, king f8 is forced, and now simply bishop to e6. White's threatening the rook on h8 still, so b4 isn't the end of the world. So let's say b4, takes, and white even has time to just grab the pawn. And black has to prove that he can actually win this knight. Probably can't do it. And really it looks as if white's just going to enjoy a better ending, more or less free of charge. And it's just a question of whether white's pawn structure is sufficiently weak that black can hold the game. Alright, well anyway, the game, as we saw, went knight to d6, knight takes b5, and then here Tal made an error with rook h to f8. So it looks pretty natural, but Bronstein has a nice little move here with knight to d4, taking advantage of the pin on the c-pawn, hitting the bishop on c6, and after bishop g2 he plays knight e6. And all of a sudden white's pieces are swarming all over once again. So rook f5 saves the rook, covers the c5 pawn, but now rook g1, bishop e4, and now not even rook takes g7, but he plays knight to c7 first, hitting the rook. Now rook takes g7, and here, okay, white is in full gallop. Lots of threats, and all his pieces are very active. The only thing we still have to fix is this bishop on a3. And now the bishop comes to b2, and if the knight moves, it goes to g7, which would be mate, depending on where the knight goes. So black is in big trouble. He tries a few more tricks, c4. So we threaten the rook, c3. Again, not really any choice here. If he plays rook to f8, for instance, then bishop f6, rook f6, and rook h7 is mate. So black is really kind of running out of gas here. He played c3, and white just cashed in. So takes, a couple more exchanges, and now white is just up 3 pawns, basically for nothing. So there was time pressure. Essentially, they had to just make it to move 40. This is move 36 now. And black tries pushing the pawn, but white's bishop and the knight on g5 both stop it from going to h3. The last little throw here, knight takes f4, but white plays rook f4, and black gives up. So the point is, okay, after rook f4, bishop takes g2, king takes g5, a7, and wins. And, well, obviously I don't need to explain why this is winning. So, brilliant game by Bronstein, of course. Won in accuracy further in, but overall just a fantastic concept, especially with this idea with g3. And again, to play it against a player like Tal makes it extra sweet and all the more remarkable. So that'll conclude our survey of some of the great tactical moments in Bronstein's career. Really, there are far more than I can mention, and I can heartily recommend to everyone that they check out books by him. So there's the old Dover classic, 200 Open Games. I highly recommend it. It's all games with e4, e5. There's The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which just came out in a new edition, so I definitely recommend that you buy that if you don't have it. And then there's also a book that came out a year or two ago called Secret Notes, and it's basically Bronstein kind of giving a bit of a travel log of his career after the fall of the Soviet Union. And he's written some other books as well, but those I would say are kind of a big three. So I hope you enjoyed this and are now eager to look at as many of his games as you can find. And I don't think you'll be disappointed. He was a fantastic player, not only a high-level player, but an extremely entertaining one, and a great writer as well. So look up his games, look up his books, and I think just from the perspective of being a chess fan, you'll enjoy it, but certainly it'll also provide you with good training material too, if you're interested in using it for that to that end. So that'll conclude it. Thank you very much, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.